For centuries, philosophers searched for logical form, as if it were hidden inside thought. Aristotle, Kant, Carnap, they all approached the same mystery. What is the infrastructure of thought? The base categories that do work when a reasoning finds settlement. Not what is thinking, but what allows thinking to go somewhere. Consider an old medical theory. Disease is caused by an imbalance of humors. The theory was wrong, yet it possessed a remarkable property. It activated an inferential machinery. Physicians could classify symptoms, generate diagnoses, propose treatments, write books, construct explanations, disagree with one another. The theory carried thought forward. It generated trajectories. Now compare that with another explanation. Disease is caused by invisible green dragons that become active every third Tuesday except when observed. The sentence can explain a particular event, but the machinery immediately collapses. No stable predictions emerge. No network forms. No future reasoning accumulates around it. So we have two false theories, but there is a difference between them. One that cuts right on the picture of what is rational and what is not. One may be wrong and yet sustain decades of research, generate predictions, organize evidence, absorb criticism, and produce increasingly sophisticated descendants. Another may be wrong and immediately collapse under the slightest pressure. Both are false, yet one carries inferential weight while the other does not. The difference cannot lie in extension, since the territory of non-truth they cover is the same. They are both distant from truth by the only measure there is, by being false. This series follows that question across the history of philosophy, beginning with Aristotle's discovery that judgment already possesses an architecture, moving through Kant's attempt to explain why certain inferential trajectories are constitutive of experience itself, and culminating in Dummett's notion of inferential harmony. We examine the many ways philosophers have tried to understand what allows thought to carry weight rather than collapse into inertia or explosion. When we represent a thought, we audit logical transitions. We trace hidden assumptions back to forgotten metaphysical commitments and follow enriched imaginative frameworks into non-orthodox logics. Those strange regions where models of the possible reveal the work they perform, transforming imaginary scenarios into explorations of reality. But beneath all these investigations lies a more primitive concern. Some representations fail because they generate no future. Others fail because they generate too much future, branching into every direction at once until nothing is ruled out and nothing is learned. Between sterility and explosion lies the narrow region where thought actually works, the region where a representation carries weight, where consequences accumulate without becoming arbitrary, where a trajectory emerges and survives pressure. Aristotle saw it earlier than almost anyone, not yet as symbolic logic, not yet as mathematical proof theory, but as the structure hidden inside judgment. He noticed that a judgment already has an architecture. S is P, the subject, the predicate, and between them, the copula, the tiny word is. At first it looks like nothing, just grammar. But the copula is doing something enormous. It isn't placing two words beside each other. It's asserting a commitment. This belongs with this. This follows from this. This can now be treated as connected. And once the connection is asserted, consequences begin to appear. Some paths close, others open. Reasoning acquires direction. When you say S is P, you're not just describing, you're creating a constraint. You're saying, from here, not everything is equally available anymore. Logical form isn't a fixed grid imposed on thought from outside. It's what you get when you ask, of everything in this judgment, the tone, the associations, the context, the words, what is the part that actually does the inferential work? The abstraction isn't arbitrary. It's guided by a specific sensitivity to what makes reasoning succeed or fail as reasoning. When a conclusion is contradicted, or when we search for logical form, we are not merely decorating thought with symbols. We are trying to isolate the particular organization of elements that allowed the reasoning to succeed or caused it to fail. If that's right, then different logics, classical, intuitionistic, relevance, aren't competing grids. They're different answers to what kind of pressure matters. When an argument closes, when the debt is honored, when the conclusion is carried, that sense of completion is not happening in empty space. It's happening at the edge of what a particular logical framework can see, and it could not be modeled from some kind of classical univocal choice, like classical logic. The closure is real, but it's real within a horizon.
My thesis begins with the history of analytic philosophy. I will hold that Russell thinks he's discovering logical form, hiding beneath grammar. But what he is actually doing is proposing a procedure for separating what is working from what is not inside a propositional structure. It is a way of carving the sentence so that its inferential life becomes visible. So one can say, this consequence is thought through the proposition, this other consequence is not. The form is not found, it is constructed. He proposes his famous paraphrases to reveal the real logical form. The King of France is bald becomes, there exists exactly one X, such that X is King of France and X is bald. Here the existential commitment is explicit and checkable, while in the natural language version, one supposes the assumption is not even up to debate. I want to be more precise here since we are talking from a historical distance, and therefore we do not need to go through all the paths Russell went. What I think is the main point of the paraphrase is to guarantee that the proposition can be false. This means that what is doing the real logical work in the proposition is not a non-existent thing, but a quantifiable structure that locks down the territory of application of bald. This also goes with Russell's indisposition of Hegelianism and coherentism in logic. For him, implication is now a matter of quantifier application, not conceptual resonance or idea combination. What carries the logical burden of the proposition cannot simply be the image, the idea, the word, or the concept of a king. The notion that a real logical form lay hidden beneath grammar, generated an enormous philosophical enthusiasm in the early 20th century. If evidence is to constrain anything, well, there must be a line. And it must be a line between what is doing the logical work inside a proposition and what is not, between what the assent activates and what it merely carries along unexamined, between what can be transported through the inferential machine and still produce something, and what silently usurps the conclusion by hiding inside a premise. That line does not require logic to be unique or exceptional. It does not require a single correct logical form. It survives by a consistent consequence, where even contradictions have explorable territories. It survives pluralism about logical systems. It even survives the naturalization of inference into neuroscience and cognitive architecture. There is a feeling most people have when they follow a valid deductive argument. The conclusion arrives with a sense of inevitability, as if it could not have been otherwise, as if the premises were always already pulling toward it. That feeling is real, but what it is striking is not what most people think. The standard story says, deduction is secure because it is formal. The conclusion is contained in the premises. Nothing is added. The necessity travels for the inference, like current through a wire. And this standard story has produced a very particular image of logic, one that has dominated the tradition and that most working logicians still implicitly carry. It is the image of logic as exceptional, logic as the domain where the mind operates without the contamination of empirical contingency. But notice what that story assumes. It assumes the wire was already there. It assumes someone already built the circuit, fixed the meanings, established the connectives, packed the content into the concepts before the inference began. Kant saw this with unusual clarity. For him, inference is not primarily an object to be studied from outside, a formal structure to be catalogued and admired. It is an inner process of judgment. Logic, on this view, is the study in the sense of explanation and not mere description of how a conclusion lands. And the way you study that is not by standing outside the mind and expecting its products. It is by interrogating from within what framework was sustainable enough to carry an inference. What conditions had to be in place for a content to be judgeable at all? Because not everything presents itself as a candidate for judgment. Not every content can enter the inferential space. Something must already be in place, a code, a framework, a set of conditions. Those determine what can connect with what. The framework is conservative in a very precise sense. It does not generate representations freely. It strains toward closure, toward the kind of harmony that formal inference enjoys naturally. because only what can in principle close, only what can in principle carry inferential weight, only that can enter the space of judgment at all. So induction needs something deduction does not. It needs imagination. Not free imagination, not the wandering of an unconstrained mind through logical space, but the conservative imagination that Kant describes as a priori schemas.
The schema is described as a mediator between pure concepts and sensory intuition, as if it were simply a translation device connecting two otherwise separate worlds. But of course, that translation is the link one need to an explanatory framework that makes sense of the alignment between concept and intuition. We schematize a way to make that intelligible. The schema acts less like a dictionary and more like a constraint on possible explanations for the alignment itself. It filters the explanations that make sense, the frameworks that can carry the richness of the connections. And this starts to resemble a problem that would later reappear in cognitive science. Fodor repeatedly argued that learning cannot proceed through unconstrained accumulation of information. A mind facing an infinite field of possible hypotheses would possess no reason to converge toward one organization rather than another. Something must already structure the search. Some architecture must already restrict what counts as a candidate for confirmation. Otherwise, learning dissolves into combinatorial chaos.
And that is why human learning is explainable.
Normativity returns. The pressure remains there, pushing toward a framework capable of restoring coherence, recovering connections, and stabilizing meaning. And perhaps this is why rationality repeatedly drifts back toward normativity. Not because minds love rules, but because unstable representations keep demanding resolution.
If logical form is just what the mind does when it reasons well, if the normative ceiling is just the upper bound of what cognitive architecture can sustain, then perhaps the transcendental question simply becomes empirical. Scan the brain, map the regions, find the signature of valid inference, and you have found the natural ground of logical form. The exceptional becomes the biological. The a priori becomes the evolved. It is an attractive move, and it has been made repeatedly with increasing technical sophistication. But there is a problem that no localization study can resolve. When a brain in 2025 performs classical logic, it is not doing what Aristotle did. It is not reasoning from scratch inside the neutral cognitive space. It is running a heavily preprocessed cultural technology.
In section 14 of Word and Object, in the section on synonymous and analytic sentences, Quine writes that the categoricals depend for their truth on the objects, however external and however inferential, of which the component terms are true, and that what those objects are is not uniquely determined by stimulus meanings. The truth functional part, he notes, is the only part the recognition of which, in a foreign language, we seem to be able to pin down to behavioral criteria. What it means is this: there is no matter of fact be it a fact about meanings attached or neural signatures attached, on which to ground the distinction between one person assenting to a logical truth because they have thoroughly mastered the nomological features of a language inherited from the physics of the 19th century, or from the mathematical notation of Frege and Russell, or from a school curriculum that drilled the same inferential patterns until they felt like nature rather than training. The behavioral evidence is identical. The neural signature, if we move the question into the scanner, is identical. The groove worn into the blackboard is identical, whether it was made by genuine logical insight or by 2.5 millennia of repetition so thorough it became indistinguishable from spontaneous thought.
That opens directly onto the question of what a naturalizing program is even looking for. If there is no matter of fact about what makes a sentence logically true, other than merely true, then there is no stable target for the neuroscientist to locate. The brain region that lights up for modus ponens may be the region that processes learned sequences, or familiar patterns, or culturally reinforced transitions.
Induction aspires to harmony. It reaches for a closure that was never stipulated, that the world has not guaranteed, but that the imagination keeps pressing toward because it has internalized logical form as its own norm. Kant's explanation of why that pressing is not irrational, why it isn't mere animal habit dressed up in logical clothing, is the transcendental deduction. The categories don't close the inductive circuit. They explain why the circuit is the right thing to be reaching for. The problem Kant faces there is parallel to the problem of harmony. Concepts are pure, intuitions are temporal. They are heterogeneous. There is no immediate reason why a category, say causality, should apply to anything given in sensible intuition. The two sides don't share a common nature, so how does the application ever get off the ground? Kant's answer is the schema.
Carnap semantic rules function almost like anabolic devices for cognition. They do not merely label or classify, they build. They take a bare synthetic structure and lever it into something metabolically richer. Modal relationships, inferential continuity, essential connections between concepts. The necessity